Hello and welcome to the final show of 2022 here on the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. So happy you can be joining us. If you're listening in on the 30th, we are pre-recording this show, but we are with Stephanie Yu, who in the new year will be the executive director of the Public Assets Institute. So glad you can be with us, Stephanie.
Thanks for having me.
And Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from the town of Brattleboro, regular contributor. So glad you can be here too. And in the new year, she'll be back in the State House.
I will indeed. Looking forward to it.
So Stephanie is with us today to talk about the annual 2022 State of Working Vermont report, which the Public Assets Institute puts out every year. And I think it is summed up in the question of, or not the question, but the statement in the report of Vermont needs a new normal. Is that a fair summary of the report?
That's really the main theme. That's right, is sort of recognizing what the pandemic has taught us, but what we knew before the pandemic too, that really we don't want to go back to the status quo before the pandemic, because there were a lot of challenges before that point.
I think that's the main theme of the Montpelier Happy Hour for the last 3 years too. So I like this synergy. And I have to tell you, Steph, when we recorded last week's episode, Olga was like a kid in a candy store thinking about having the report come out. And like, it is her very favorite report of the year. She looks forward to it with bated breath. So this is maybe even her favorite episode of the year because we get to talk about it.
Well, I appreciate that. We spent a lot of time on it, so I'm glad to hear it's time well spent.
It is. Well, one thing I love about the report, as someone who's in media, I'm constantly thinking about, how do we take big concepts that maybe aren't part of everyone's daily lives and communicate them in a way that people can understand how they're being impacted by these concepts or these policies or this information. And I just think the report does it so well. And I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
So, Stephanie, there's a lot to pull apart in the report. It was broken down into a bunch of different buckets. There was the big picture, there was home, there was work, and there was life, I believe.
Got it. Yep.
Woohoo! Mm-hmm. Gold star. Mm-hmm. And for you, as you were putting together the report, what were there aha moments, or were you like, unfortunately, yeah, that's kind of what we expected?
It's a good question. I think that, part of this is the pandemic data are so sort of disrupted and messy that we spent a lot of time trying to make a coherent story out of this, because like you say, we're trying to kind of put some of these pieces together in a way that where the story can make sense to people. And I think one of the things that was interesting is we kept going back and forth about what was home, what was life, what was work, because they've gotten so blurry in so many ways over these last few years, right? Like these things are all impacting one another. The childcare capacity probably has something to do with the number of people who haven't gone back to work. So, it was really all very messy and tied together. But we're really trying to get a sense of how Vermonters are doing. And part of what we wanted to look at too was recognize the pretty extraordinary government response at both the federal and state level, and the reality that made a huge difference for people, but it was temporary. So sort of watching this kind of, this flow of the support, that it helped a lot of people, and that now in the absence of a lot of that government support, people are sort of falling back, through the cracks. So, how can we sort of prevent that from happening, and what worked really well in the pandemic response that should be sustained?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the pieces of information that surprised me the most is how homelessness had increased since 2020, which is a sad statistic.
It is. And clearly a lot of people's income was disrupted, at least temporarily, if not longer term. We're still, employment's not back, jobs aren't back. And that's a slightly different story in Vermont than it is in the rest of the country. Like the rest of the country has mostly recovered. And again, we're looking at the kind of US total. So there's different pockets, but Vermont has been slow to recover in terms of jobs and employment. And and the question is why that is. Are those health considerations? Are those some of this childcare challenges? Are those, it's probably a mix of all of the above. And that's part of, it has been hard to really sort of piece together. So for those people who haven't come back to the labor force, how are they making it work, or are they making it work? And in some cases, I think the homelessness is one indicator that, that people are really struggling and had such disruption that now, now the question is, what do we do about it?
I think it's also, recoveries in Vermont are always slower than the rest of the country, right? Like we know that from all kinds of economic disruptions. And I've also, in the context of that, there's also like, it always takes the future a little bit of time for Vermont to catch up with, or takes Vermont a little bit of time to catch up with the future. And so when I think about a trend that I think most of the country was already aware of, which is the financialization of real estate markets, and how it felt like that really didn't hit Vermont until the pandemic. And so so there's sort of the individual economic circumstances that have impacted Vermonters and the ways that we, through the pandemic, used money to solve that problem rather than policy in a lot of cases. And then we have this trend of increased financialization of markets in the face of that economic disruption. And I wonder how much of that hit these problem areas of Vermont's already existing housing struggles to create a perfect storm. And
I think there's a couple of things you're picking up on there, right? Which is that Vermont does tend to have this sort of slow burn phenomenon in terms of the economic. After the Great Recession, our sort of trough was much later than a lot. And so the recovery has been sort of behind. And similarly, when you look at sort of the employment and the jobs, like, the US seems to be ahead a little bit in terms of what happens. But one of the things that we do pick up in this home section is sort of looking at housing prices, both houses for sale and rental properties, and really looking at the fact that they were growing ahead of the pandemic, right? But then there was pretty big spike in that, and how much of that is speculation and how much of that is, we also saw a whole bunch of people move to Vermont. Like we saw a pretty big group, net migration, pretty significant over into 2021. So how much of that is sort of real demand for people who really want to move to Vermont too? There's an element of that too.
Yeah.
And, Emily, you just said something interesting of, solving a problem with money rather than policy, which we've talked about on the show before. But I'm wondering if there was any specific policies or buckets of money that you were thinking of when you.
Oh gosh, there are a bunch of them. So in the context of housing, it's that we didn't change anything about our housing policies whatsoever, or zoning policies, or growth policies, or homeless services policies, or anything. We just, and I'm incredibly glad we house people in motels. I don't want to act that I'm not. I just think we could have done both, chewed gum and walked at the same time. And like I say that knowing that like we were all and still are under like tremendous crisis and pressure. And I think everyone for the most part, people in state government did like even better than they could have to serve people. And each of us did like really the very best we could to serve our communities and our neighbors through this. So I don't want to I think there's a sports metaphor here that I don't actually know. I feel it on the edge of my sentence.
I think part of it is that and it's not particular to Vermont. I think it's been true kind of in government, but we can definitely point to specific circumstances in Vermont, which is there's just less capacity for long-term planning. And so when the crisis hits, you're sort of already doing all you can to kind of keep up with what's going on.
Yes.
And so there's less ability to kind of have that long-term peace in mind. You're just kind of reactive. And again, I think that's not, like you say, it's not to disparage any of the effort or pretty amazing things I think that the state government and the federal government to some extent did during COVID. But it sort of, it illustrated the fact that some of these things are sort of patched together on an ongoing basis. And so therefore, when more demand is created, it makes it that much harder to kind of have longer term solutions.
Mm-hmm. So when
Yeah.
you think about that lack of capacity for planning, and Senator Ballant, back before she was Congresswoman-elect, Becca Ballant used to always talk about how the state was held together with duct tape and baling twine. And I really hold on to that one as like an essential truth of how to do our work here. What are the other aspects and impacts that you see in the report related to that sort of lack of capacity? I think about that a lot in the context of employers having a lack of capacity for long-term planning and what the state can do in that case, but I'm curious other places you see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the childcare is another good example, I think, where we already knew that the system was stretched. We also knew that people weren't making enough money who work in the sector, and we knew that parents couldn't afford to pay more. We knew that childcare was already hanging on by a thread, or, and in some cases just woefully inadequate, right? Because the whole sort of paradigm didn't work. So I think that's another place where it became very obvious that we needed a longer term solution. And, I think, and a lot of good work has been done, and there's a pretty good roadmap on what to do about childcare. It does. And this is a case where we need both money and policy, right? Like the solution is both those things. But I think that's another example. I think it was pretty clear that the food aid structures were stretched pretty thin, and part of it is because there's again, there's sort of this patchwork of programs, and how can we do it in a coherent way? And I think there's potentially some good work being done to think about how to make these programs more. Again, the immediate response in the pandemic was we're going to get people fed one way or another. We're not necessarily going to spend a lot of time building the perfect structure, but on reflection, it would be great to think about what worked well and what are the best distribution mechanisms. And is it cash in people's pockets, or is it, active distribution? What does it look like?
One aspect of the food system and the emergency food system and what happened during the pandemic that really shone a light for me on sort of we need to do shone a light on whatever sort of existing problems, is that so much of it and so much of our social service structure is built with volunteer labor. And during the pandemic, that was incredibly vulnerable volunteer labor who were not, folks, often older Vermonters who couldn't be in public. And we know that, as that population is aging, that volunteer capacity is aging too. And so how are we building systems in the state that are more robust and resilient, given this volunteer base that is not able to do it? And a new volunteer base not coming online because we are all working so hard and so many hours to pay our bills.
Yep.
Well, I also think one thing that was very different during the pandemic compared to other times, and Stephanie, you just said it with the food system, is there was this belief, attitude, sense, whatever you want to call it, we're going to get people fed no matter what. We're going to get people housed no matter what. And I think sometimes that is a different way to come at a problem than, well, let's try this, or we don't have enough money, or maybe some of the other things we tell ourselves in other times of our lives.
I think that's a really good point, and that's sort of a theme we were trying to pick up in the report of, I do think, and it wasn't just government swinging into action, right? There was a lot of mutual aid happening. There was a lot of communities helping each other. There was a lot of sort of taking matters into your own hands when you saw something that needed to be done. And I think, how can we tap that? I mean, government is still the best way to deliver these, services in a systemic way and take care of people. But we want to keep that spirit going and recognize, like you say, that a lot of our programs were sort of, there is this, I think that the overall state budget process tends to be more focused on, this is the money we have, so we'll do what we can with what we have, rather than this is the need that we see and this is how we meet that need. So I think that spirit of the pandemic, if we could keep that going in kind of the budget process and going forward, that would be huge. It would be a different conversation for sure.
Definitely. We've done a lot of talking about housing and you touched on it a little bit, but during the pandemic, we saw home prices. I think the experience for a lot of people is home prices went through the roof, rents went through the roof. What did you see in the report? Did your data support that? What story did you see?
Yeah, there were some interesting things that were surprising. On the whole, I think that's right. We saw big jumps in rent and we saw pretty big jumps in housing prices. But again, some of that trend was happening before the pandemic. Certainly driven a little bit more. And we also see a real disparity when you look at rents in the Chittenden County area versus the rest of the state. There's a real difference. There's definitely, well, and a lot of rental property is in, the Northwest. But you see those prices really being much higher than sort of the US average, but the statewide average in parts of Vermont is not so out of whack with sort of the national averages of rent, and even trailing a little bit in terms of the growth over the course of the pandemic, right? But it's really sort of the Burlington, South Burlington area that's kind of driving those high prices. And then again, with the housing, one of the things that was surprising was that prices went up in every county, but volume of sales were actually lower in Chittenden, which was sort of interesting. Even though the prices went up, the volume, not by a huge amount, but the point is it wasn't sort of this huge spike, even though I think it kind of felt that way because there was sort of probably pent up demand over the course of the pandemic that all probably seemed to be happening at once. I'll also add, I do live in Burlington, and there was a reassessment in Burlington over the pandemic. So I think that also sort of got a lot of attention and people's notice in terms of what it meant for home prices. So lots of moving pieces.
Well, I think the home prices too, when you talk about Vermont somewhat being at the average in line with US rents, I think that brings us back to wages and what people can afford to pay. And it does seem, you shared with us your jobs report that we'll link to in the show notes, where you talk about how you compared prices of goods and services in Vermont to the rest of the country, pretty much in line, kind of like with rents. But with wages, we were regionally, I think you mean New England, we were the second lowest. So it seems like we still have that trend of costs being basically in line with the rest of the country, but our wages still not keeping up with that.
That's right. And it's been true for as long as we've been looking at this, right? That our prices tend to be around the US average, give or take a little bit, but that wages are significantly below the US average, in this case, 83%, right? So if the US is 100, we're at 83%. And those are average. So, obviously there's a lot of wiggle room around that, but that's been a real problem. And we did see, wages have grown. I mean, what we haven't talked about yet is inflation, which has obviously been a big deal over this year. And so, are people better off even if wages have grown? Are they keeping up with inflation? We know that they weren't really keeping up with inflation for the decade before the pandemic. And even though we did see real wages go up, there were a number of things happening with wages during the pandemic. So I think that first year, a lot of the problem was that a whole bunch of low wage jobs just disappeared. So that it looked like wages went up, but really it was just sort of, we were taking the bottom of the pool out, the bottom of the scale out of the pool. But now it does look like real wages are going up, but inflation is going up so quickly that it's not really helping. So it's kind of a mixed bag on wages. We are seeing some growth, but if inflation stays high, then that's, it doesn't help us that much. And this problem of being persistently low in the region and persistently low relative to the US average. So yeah, I think, in terms of spending power, despite all this churn, I'm not sure we're much better off.
So you ready for the non-economist question?
Go for it.
I have to admit, I always come back to this discrepancy between costs and wages in Vermont, because there's a part of my brain that just can't wrap itself around it. And it just asks, how do we keep our economy going? And how are people keeping themselves fed and sheltered? And we see, given the givens, a lot of people are making it work, but I don't understand how this can even exist. That
Yeah.
is my like moment.
No, I get it. I think it's a good question. I think the answer is that a lot of people are stretched really thin. As Emily was saying, I think a lot of people are stretched really thin. I think people are working more than one job. I think there's sort of, there's a lot of these pieces where,
I mean, Olga and I both work more than one job. Like it's like,
right.
yeah. Yeah.
And I think people are stuck in their housing to some extent, right? Like I do think for people who have, if there's a fixed income and your house value keeps going up, you can't move because there's nowhere else, even if people were looking to downsize, there's this challenge, so of older Vermonters, that could be a factor too. So, I think it is a real challenge. Like we're trying to figure out how people are making it work. And I think the answer is a whole lot of everything. Right. Sometimes it's shared housing. Sometimes it's less housing than you need. Sometimes it's working multiple jobs. Sometimes it's relying on family for childcare. That might not be ideal, but you're doing it. I think it's a whole mix of how we do it.
And when we talk about that, making it work, so that includes like not getting the healthcare you need, that will have very huge long-term impacts, right? It's people not going to the dentist. It's people not eating healthy foods. It's about like people, again, having unideal childcare, which often leads to like, massive amounts of childhood trauma or more stressful outcomes at home or, people struggling in school.
Yeah, or even just being behind in school, right? Even if it doesn't go to that extreme, it's still, it's not ideal.
It's not ideal. And like, it's not like when we talk about not ideal, I think sometimes it's like the disconnect for folks who are not stretched that thin. They think that not ideal means like your kid never ever watches TV and like always eats broccoli and like you go skiing for it. Like it's just when we're talking about not ideal, it's like
pretty
chronic
bad
stress and no health care.
Yeah. And I guess the next place my brain goes when it's asking these questions, and I'll just add this other thought that for a lot of us who grew up swimming in this water of making it work, you just make it work, and it doesn't necessarily occur to you to think that life operates any other way. But on top of that, I guess the next place my brain goes is, why is this okay for all of us? Like, why are we okay with it?
Right. I mean,
when it seems pretty basic to have costs and wages in alignment.
Right. It seems like a pretty straightforward proposition that if you work full time, you should be able to make ends meet, right? I mean, we've sort of heard that theme, I think, before. And I think early in the pandemic, I think people, when seeing that essential workers were putting themselves at risk, whether they wanted to or not, in some cases because they had to, and recognizing that they were really underpaid and really struggling, and yet, a lot of that aid was temporary. So now we're sort of back to it's employer dependent, in terms of what whether or not people are getting a decent wage that can make ends meet. We are seeing enough. Another theme that has been really clear is the job openings far outnumber the people looking for work. That's been true in Vermont. It's been true across the country, right? So there's obviously a lot of demand for employees, which, we've all seen. I mean, any of the businesses you go to, they may have reduced hours, they're making adjustments because they're having a hard time finding staff. So I do think that there is potential, that the wages, that there are clear, and in some cases, I think we heard the sort of great resignation theme. There's definitely people who are trading up where, they are finding jobs that pay better wages. And so these sort of low end jobs where they're not increasing the wages are having a tough time finding people. So hopefully that's good pressure that can bring those wages up to a more reasonable level. But, it also sort of just illustrates the complications of making it all work.
I was having dinner last night with some friends, a pretty big age range, sort of folks in their 30s. It was like really folks ranging from like the age of 16 up to 65. And we were all talking about like moments that we remember from some point in our life that we're like conscious of as like memories of when the economy worked differently than it does now. And I did not start the conversation. So I was like, fairly thrilled that it was happening, being And so some friends were talking about like living in Boston with Reagan and like seeing the full deregulation of the housing market. And they were actually working in a homeless shelter at that point. So the housing market was deregulated. They immediately saw like thousands more people coming through their door, like really almost immediately. It was the same time that state hospitals were shut down and a bunch of other things, right? So like that's their marking point of like their like clearest memory of the economy breaking, basically. And another friend was talking about living, who's much younger, was talking about living on the West Coast, but like remembering as a child, one of her parents worked as a carpenter and the other one didn't work. And like they lived in a house and like on the West Coast, like in the San Francisco area, right? And so, and like how fully aware they are that that's impossible in that area now. And we were all just sort of like going through it. And I remember like, you know, living in Brattleboro and waiting tables and paying my rent, like without worry. Like I would just pay my bills every month out of my income. And so it's like that felt experience that when we talk about it, about the disconnect between wages and costs, when we're actually talking to each other about it, I think we move out of this experience of like, oh, that was sort of that's my individual failing now because I didn't strive hard enough, or I've like been unwilling to take that job in the bank or whatever it is. And moves it more into like, oh, wow, these are systemic forces that we've like seen happen throughout our lifetimes because of political decisions made or political decisions not made. And I think it's I'm sort of curious how we can translate like the State of Working Vermont into like those kinds of conversations that people are having at dinner.
I'm going to stop us there simply because we need to hear from some of our underwriters, but let's jump in on that after the break. So everyone on WBEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, stay tuned. We shall return.
Okay.
Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WBEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us wherever you find your podcasts, as well as BCTV. Thank you so much to all the work they do getting us on the public access stations around Vermont and even in a few places in other areas of New England. So thanks for tuning in. Hey, Emily.
Yes, Olga.
Let's remind our listeners of what we need to remind our listeners of.
Well, I'd like to remind our listeners that the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, and not the stations or platforms that our voices are streamed on.
Why, thank you.
Quite welcome.
And if you are just joining us, we are speaking with Stephanie Yu from the Public Assets Institute, and we're talking about the 2022 State of Working Vermont report. And before the break, Emily raised this really great question. She'd been having dinner with friends and basically asked, when do you remember the economy breaking? Is kind of how it came. Oh, no, you didn't ask it. Someone else in your dinner party asked. But Stephanie, you were kind of talking about that and looking at the economy systemically. And you, during the break, you made a really great statement about generational differences and why these economic experiences might lead to that. Could you kind of dive back into that for listeners?
Yeah, and I'll just say, I just to answer the question that Emily got asked at the dinner party. I mean, I do think so. I graduated from college in '99, right? So that's how old I am. But it also meant that just before the Great Recession, and so friends that graduated 2 years later had a very different experience coming into the job market at that time. Right? So just like seeing you could see it, and then what that has meant for their long-term sort of prospects, right? It just changed the whole trajectory of their careers by coming out at that time. So that was it. So I hear that, and there's things like the gasoline crisis in the 70s before my time, but you definitely hear like people still talking about it, especially in the wake of the energy prices today. So like, there are these sort of marking points that people have, I think, in terms of how they think about the economy. But the generational differences piece for me, I mean, it's not just generational. It also, there's racial disparities. There's geographic disparities. But it is true that for some people, in certain circumstances in a certain era, that if you worked hard, you could make it work. And so still feels true to a lot of people that should be the experience that other people are having. And that if it's not true, then it's, the fault of the individual, or it's, as opposed to recognizing that there are these systemic forces that have really shifted away. I think a lot of people sort of point to those Reagan years as a major shift in sort of economic thinking and government policy shift. And welfare reform in the 90s as being another sort of major government change that really sort of changed how we approach some of these things. So, I think to go back to sort of your original comments, Olga, I think people need to be able to follow a narrative arc. I mean, it works for us to be able to sort of follow the narrative arc. And so if you can kind of identify some of those major points where things kind of shift and start trending in another direction, a tougher direction, in this case of wages and prices, I think that just helps people kind of understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. I think unions is another big one. So my stepfather worked for Con Edison, like as a lineman, his whole career, went into the Navy for just a few years after high school, and then started a job at Con Ed and worked that until he retired. And now lives and Con Ed, like Con Edison in New York, is one of the biggest utilities in the country and had one of the strongest unions in the country. And he is living a very, very comfortable retirement. And part of that is stocks that were given to employees that appreciated. Part of that is permanent healthcare, and a pass at every single state park in the country, the wildest, most wonderful benefits that just to really improve quality of life on a fundamental level, and then some more, spacious levels. And how incredibly normalized that is for him, because that is what his whole generation of young men growing up in the Bronx, really regardless of race even, were able to experience in that particular 10 years of youth. It's real, and it's wild. It's wild that he has this whole cohort of folks that all had that level of comfort straight out of high school. But I think even in Vermont, that wasn't possible because we didn't have those union jobs ever here to that extent. So that's sort of that's another sort of turning point on my list of turning points as well.
That's interesting what you say, Emily, because I'm trying to think through my own family tree and experiences. And I think for a lot of the men in my family, it was the military. Being drafted was not what they would have preferred how they would have preferred to enter the military, but there was training, there was post-education, there was the VA benefits afterwards. And for a number of women in my family, it was becoming nurses. Again, education and training and interesting.
And that's one, it's when we talk about childcare and, women's work and, nursing is one of the rare places that women's work was unionized. And so it's one of the rare places that women's work paid a living wage and actually still pays a living wage.
I had my great grandmother was a invisible mender for the American Woolen Company, and she had a pretty comfortable life, and I think hers was a union job.
So interesting, the Woolen Company is now darn tough, right? And interestingly, their starting wages are below $15 an hour still to this day. Posted on the website, their starting wages are below $15 an hour. Just looked the other day because I wondered if it was still true.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So leaving the narrative arc for a minute, I'd love to talk about Vermont and how Vermont's economy is structured, because the scale, that we don't have the scale for unions, that we don't have this, the kind of union power we see in other places in the country that's really resurging. But I also think about sort of the power of government and the fact that at least in Windham County, I think a huge proportion of jobs are funded by either direct state jobs or state grants and contracts, and how that I just froze, sorry, how that changes our are experiencing the
ripple
economic
effects.
wages.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's true in most states that the public sector tends both the sort of direct public sector and the sort of subcontracting of the public sector does kind of have pretty important effects on sort of the rest of the economy, because it does drive some of those things, and tends to have unionized, well negotiated benefits. And sometimes, like in Vermont, there are certain roles where if you're doing the job as a state employee, you get certain benefits, and if you're doing it through a subcontractor, you might not have access to those same benefits. Again, true in other states too, but just sort of like there are sort of these tiers even within the public sector. But I do think it's true that that the scale of Vermont makes those things sort of more visible and more kind of obvious and maybe more influential. I don't know. I think it's probably pretty close to what people experience. And in some places, I worked for the state of Michigan for a number of years. Again, a state with a strong union history, strong public sector unions, big public sector workforce. But I think a lot of the private sector unions were what sort of drove the wage expectations throughout the state. So I think there is something to that. And I think that public sector jobs should be good jobs, right? Like that should be the example that should be set, that healthcare should be taken care of, because some of it too is the fact that, if people don't have a comfortable retirement and need support for longer, if people don't have healthcare and retirement and they're going to be relying on the state, there's a lot of reasons why it makes sense to have strong public sector jobs and strong private sector jobs. But, point is lead by example, right?
And I think I'm talking less about public sector jobs and more about, I think in Vermont, the contracted jobs by the public sector are actually incredibly low wage because they're sort of where we cut corners on particularly Medicaid rates. And so when we think of folks who are doing homeless services, folks who are doing home health care, folks who are doing some of those starting wages for master's degree required jobs are like $18 an hour.
Yep. Yeah, and I think you also brought up this sort of gendered theme too, which is how many of these jobs are care jobs, which are been undervalued for a long time because they're women's work. But there is also this disconnect, I think you're right, in terms of the designated agencies and who, how the terms so if you're a social worker for the state versus if you're a social worker for one of these other subcontracted agencies, there is this real disparity. There's also a challenge, we've been thinking too about, how does the state use temporary workers? How, there's also, even within sort of state workers, there's different ways that it's sort of, there's some ways in which, like universities, for example, there's a lot less, there's many fewer tenured positions, much more adjuncts, relying on sort of how do you do this in a way that, it's sort of the gig economy, but in showing up in different ways, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and I think what we're touching on here, and I'll just be a little more explicit about, is that when it comes to being compensated for your work, whatever that work is, that compensation can come in many forms, not just the hourly rate you're making, but it impacts your healthcare, it impacts your retirement. And I'm guessing, Stephanie, that is a little bit in the report you talk about how for most women in Vermont, there's been a slower return to the workplace than for many men. And I'm guessing that one reason that is important is because the longer someone's out of the workforce, regardless of gender, that impacts their Social Security and a lot of their long-term earnings and their retirement. Am I seeing that correctly?
Absolutely. I mean, there's, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, there was sort of a lot of this talk about the she-cession. And over the last couple of years, it has been totally clear. Like it's not a clear cut, because there's sort of a mixed bag in terms of the data, right? So what we were showing were how many jobs are held by women. So again, this might be a case where more women held second jobs and they had to, they either were able to go to one job because it started paying better, or they had to because whatever the reasons are, right? So, but it's certainly clear that there are a lot of differences along gender lines, in the labor market. terms of how things are valued, in terms of the jobs, in terms of, and I think you're making a good point. If women take time off to have children, or there's other reasons why they might be in and out of the workforce, or they're caregiving, in some cases, caregiving for parents or, other family members or these things and taking time out. Yeah. Then there's all these ripple effects on Social Security on long-term, tend to be in jobs with fewer benefits and the pensions and all of these things. So, yeah, we definitely see there being some pretty stark differences. And, I think, part of what we've wanted to look at is sort of number of hours worked, and that's been tough to get at from a gender perspective. But there's some evidence sort of at the national level that there's some real differences there in terms of women cutting back on hours, still being employed, but cutting back on hours because of all these other sort of responsibilities. The sandwich generation of caregiving for both elders and kids, and all of these pieces. So I don't think Vermont's immune to any of that.
I'm really curious about, and I am straight up personally invested in this question. And so I am going to just be very clear about that. But this idea of reduced hours and the trend towards reduced hours, or multiple jobs with reduced hours because of caregiving, or say you want to serve in the legislature or whatever it is. And how so many of the sort of benefits that are wrapped around the workforce are not available in those cases. And so how does the government adapt to a changing labor force? I don't even want to say compensate. I just want to say adapt. So, public service loan forgiveness is much less possible in the case of part-time work, for instance, or, healthcare or family medical leave, or all of those, all of those pieces that we put around the workforce that are dependent on labor are very rarely available for adjunct professors or part-time restaurant workers or whatever they are. And if this is the trend that we're going in, and we're just going to acknowledge it, what do we need to put in place as a state to make sure that folks are still getting their needs met?
Well, I think ultimately, our position has been that as much of this as we can divorce from the whim of the employer is what we should be doing, right? So, certainly, healthcare for all, available to everyone, and it's not attached to your employer. Similar to retirement, there's been this push on a public retirement plan that hasn't quite happened in Vermont, but it's been intended to happen for the last 5 years, right?
The incoming treasurer is really excited about it, for whatever that's worth.
Well, that's great. And it's been hard to do, right? Part of the reason it didn't get, I don't think it was that the last treasurer wasn't interested. I think it was hard to do, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's hard to do, but family leave, sick leave, all these things we're thinking about as more, if we pool it as a state, it makes more sense than having it's luck of your employer. And it's not subject to the number of hours you're working. It's just something that everybody gets, right? So I do think that ultimately that is the model that a lot of other places have that makes a lot of sense. And yet it seems really tough to get there. So what do we do in the meantime? Right. I think, what do we do in the meantime? And I think what you're suggesting is recognizing that part-time work is real work. Part-time work is, there's a whole degree of part-time work that's professional, that's whatever. So what is the sort of baseline guarantee of benefits that goes along with however many hours you work, and how do we make that reasonable?
Yeah.
And that your question, Emily, makes me go to another thing I think, Stephanie, you and I have talked about in the past, but I'm fascinated with this idea of how many people are working multiple jobs for a variety of reasons, and how I'm not sure that we really track that. And so I wonder, I know you may not have the data, Stephanie, but I'm curious, if we were to really kind of track labor trends or track wages based on checking that people have more than one job, what do you think would change? Any thoughts on what we might see differently, or what we would have to do to actually have that data?
So there is some tracking of the multiple jobs, but it's pretty limited. It's interesting in the sense. So it's reported. So it's jobs. It's sort of jobs held. So if you have a job and you have a small business on the side that you do part-time or something like that, that's not going to show up as multiple jobs. I think there's a fair amount of that in Vermont, like sort of the side hustle of whatever it is that you're going to do, right? But it doesn't count as a job, or it's a gig thing and it doesn't count. It's not going to show up in the job numbers because I haven't looked in at least a year at the multiple job holdings. There is some tracking of it, but they're pretty inadequate and incomplete data, I think. But what's interesting is that it hasn't changed much. Like for as long as they've been tracking it, it's held pretty steady. But you also can't tell like if one person is holding 3 jobs or 2 people are holding 2 jobs, or you can't always tell sort of how it all adds up. So there are some of those data. I think we could do a better job tracking a lot of this stuff. I think a lot of it does come back to what is good data collection. Our Department of Labor does a pretty good job. Some of it's happening at the federal level, but the state Department of Labor has the ability to ask the feds to collect more information. And I think we could be doing more of that. But and then the hours work data also can be incomplete. So it doesn't always give us a good picture of what's going on in terms of, can you really see sort of this decline? And a lot of it is not broken out by demographic. So can we see it by gender? Can we see it by race? Can we see it by income level, which would obviously be very telling, right? Like that gives you a lot of information. But I think your original question was from a benefits perspective, what do we do about that, right? Like if you're combined working 40 hours a week, shouldn't you qualify for any of these things? Again, I think the bottom line is it shouldn't be tied to your employer. And I think what that doesn't get to too is this unpaid work challenge, right? The unpaid caregiving part, that is a huge part of our economy, that is critical to our economy functioning, and yet does not get sort of valued in any official way, right? So, I'd love to hear if Emily has any more thoughts on that piece. Sure, you thought about
it. No surprises that I've thought about it, and I don't think any of my thoughts on it are particular surprises to anyone who's ever listened to the show before, or to you, Steph. But I absolutely, I think the more we can move benefits that have sort of traditionally been tied to employment into the public sector, I think both it will help us adjust to the increasing gig economy and sort of create parity between the various ways that people make a living. But also, again, the scale of our businesses being so small in Vermont makes a lot of those things that might actually work in other parts of the country really, really hard here. And so I don't blame a lot of the employers here that they don't offer this wide range of benefits. It's really hard to do at a small scale, not just like you need real HR capacity in order to just even administer something like that. And you need like long-term planning and the financial resources and all of that. It's more expensive to do at a smaller scale. My internet's a little bit flickery, so I just want to apologize to anyone who's watching us on video. I think probably it's not going to be the best quality video. So I think having the state, a publicly administered universal family medical leave program that includes care for self, care for loved ones, leave for, caregiving purposes, I think that's really essential. I think separating healthcare and retirement from individual employers matters. I think things like public service loan forgiveness, a lot of that's at the federal level, but the state's starting to do more of it, and it needs to be separated from employer. And I'm really nervous that there's a new push in the midst of the housing crisis to have employer provided housing, and that I feel incredibly nervous about. And we're at a point in the housing crisis where it's sort of like any housing, anytime is better than no housing. But I think that's a really nerve-wracking trend for me because it's tying yet another benefit or yet another like essential human need to the employer. So that's some of what I think we need to be doing about it. I also think that there's more we could do to be strengthening labor laws related to shorter more part-time work. So a lot of service jobs have been sort of increasingly managed via AI. And so, on-demand scheduling, we could just say it's not allowed. It's like not, so an end to on-demand scheduling, having like, both reliable and flexible work schedules for people who are engaging in caregiving. all of that is stuff that is sort of a necessary component of good labor laws. And I think it's another place that sort of like Vermont hasn't quite caught up with the future that's happened everywhere else.
Mm-hmm. I'm always amazed at how different parts of our community, our lives, however you want to put it, are not in alignment. For example, a school day runs from 7 a.m. to 3 something, depending on whether you're in high school or elementary, and yet work days go from, say, 9 to 5.
Yeah.
Like simple things like that just aren't in alignment.
And the bus schedule for, public transit runs from like 9:30 to 2:45 or something,
Right.
And
Right.
It's interesting, like when I think about some of the employers in the community that are hiring and hiring and hiring for, 10-hour shifts, like what if you offered 5-hour shifts that like actually meant like, I wonder what would happen,
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what would happen if you like posted your wages and your hours publicly so that people would know what they were getting themselves into. And they might go, oh, that actually works for my weird life, because everyone feels like their situation is so unique. And given the power difference between employers and employees on, the application process, people are really scared to ask those questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that the scheduling point is a really good one too, because it's not just, it's what's guaranteed. I mean, and this is a good time in terms of our restaurant and hospitality sectors. I mean, we've certainly all seen restaurants who have stayed with takeout only, or only open 3 days a week, or only open for dinner, or have changed that up. And part of that, I mean, you waited tables, I waited tables through college and grad school and bartended and all that stuff. And it's like, you never knew when you were going to get called off. And when you were relying on that money for your bills, and they could just send you home in the middle of a shift if it wasn't. And so you never really knew what your income was going to be. And it's really tough. And if that was your only source of income and you were trying to provide for a family on that, it's tough.
So I'm actually waiting tables now tonight. And one, in some ways, the particular shape of the economy has been really helpful because, I was asked if I could come in tonight. Usually I work Saturday nights, but we're going to only Saturday nights. We're going to be closed this Saturday night because it's Christmas Eve, I think. And so I said I would cover tonight. And I was like, I actually can't come in till 5 because of other stuff. And, he was like, sure. I have never worked in a restaurant where that would have been okay. So like in some ways, the workforce shortage has increased sort of like negotiation capacity. And there's a massive ice storm coming and we're going to be open. I don't think I'm going to make any money. So like, why are,
Yep.
And there's like no guaranteed wage attached to any of it. It's wild. It's like incredibly unreliable source of labor. So even in the face of like this increased negotiating power for employees, it's still like, really deep inequities in what's happening.
Yep. Time to get rid of the tipped minimum wage.
What's that?
Time to get rid of the tipped minimum wage.
It is indeed in time to get rid of the tipped minimum wage. Yes.
Unfortunately, we are just about out of time, Stephanie. I know we have covered a lot of ground. What do you think is important to leave listeners with right now as we go into the new year?
I think an optimistic note would be nice in terms of what's possible. I mean, we really saw what's possible. And I think that all of the stuff is possible at the state level. It's obviously great when there's federal support for any of these things, but we can do a whole lot as a state. And so I have hope that this is a good time, that there's a conversation, like that there's an openness to that conversation that there wasn't pre-pandemic. So I'm hopeful.
Thank you. How about you, Emily? Any thoughts for listeners as we say goodbye to 2022?
Oh gosh, I'm actually completely in alignment with Steph here. I still feel that we have learned so many lessons in the last 2 years and we can carry them into the future. We understand what government can do when it works well. And I think we've moved out of the crisis enough to some degree that I think we can stop being reactive and be proactive to like really incorporate those lessons into our public service.
Thank you.
I also just want to express some incredible gratitude for Steph, for your partnership through, a few wild years. And Olga, this show, we've been doing this. We're about to start our 5th year.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Happy Hour. And so having this time to reflect with you every single week about what is happening in Vermont politics, what's happening in the Vermont economy has been a tremendous source of learning for me. And so thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that so much, Emily. And I think one thing I keep appreciating about this show, both you and all our guests who have come on the show, is just people's willingness to show up and have these conversations. And for folks who haven't been on the show, just for context, we often say to the folks we invite, you're the expert, so we want to hear from you. We don't like sit down and say, well, they're going to talk about this question or this question. We kind of have a rough framework, and then we just dive in. And people's willingness to do that, I just have so much appreciation for. And I think it's one reason we tend to have really good conversations. So thank you, Emily. Thank you, Steph, for seeing out 2022 with us. What I have been sitting with is maybe not as optimistic. Mainly in my life, I've been dealing with a lot of grief, but it's made me think of these last 2 years and sort of that collective upheaval, grief that can come from that, regardless of the upheaval. And I guess I have, in an odd way, a little gratitude for that too, because grief has made me look at my life so differently, and at problems so differently. And I hope, given the collective grief that many of us have been going through since the pandemic, I guess that is my hope too, of like you said, Emily, the quote of maybe this is not darkness, but this is the birth of death, but this is the birth canal. So that is my hope going into 2023. So thank you, everybody. Many happy blessings for 2023, and we will see you all in the new year.